Hello there, and welcome back to the Sleepy Science channel. Tonight, we are not gazing upward. Tonight, we are going somewhere else entirely. Somewhere ancient. Somewhere still. We are going to the Grand Canyon. It sits in the high desert of northern Arizona, carved by water and time into something almost impossible to describe. A wound in the earth so vast and so deep that the first explorers to reach its rim reportedly refused to believe what they were seeing. They thought it was a mirage. They thought their minds were playing tricks on them in the desert heat. But it was real. It is real. And it has been there, slowly deepening, slowly widening, for longer than our species has existed. There is something about the canyon that invites stillness. Perhaps it is the scale of it. Perhaps it is the silence that settles inside it after dark, when the last tourists have gone and the only sound is the distant whisper of the Colorado River, running somewhere far below. Or perhaps it is simply the age of it. The way its walls speak of a patience so vast. It makes every human worry feel temporary. Tonight, we will walk the canyon together, not on foot, but through story, through science and wonder and quiet fact. You do not need to do anything except rest. Let your body settle. Let your thoughts grow softer, and allow the slow, unhurried story of the Grand Canyon to carry you gently into sleep. If these quiet journeys bring you comfort, I invite you to like and subscribe, or leave a thought in the comments below. It helps other weary souls find their way here too, one sleepy listener at a time. But for now, all you need to do is breathe and let the canyon come to you. Let us begin. The Grand Canyon is 277 miles long. When most people picture the Grand Canyon, they imagine a single dramatic overlook, the kind of image you might see on a postcard or a calendar. A great chasm opening up before you, stretching into a warm haze of orange and red. But the Grand Canyon is not one view. It is hundreds of them. From one end to the other, the canyon runs for 277 miles. That is roughly the distance between two major cities. A drive that would take hours on an open highway. And yet every mile of that distance holds its own ridges, its own alcoves, its own hidden tributaries and cathedral-like spaces that no other mile contains. You could spend a lifetime exploring it and still find corners that feel entirely new. Geologists, hikers, river guides, and painters have all spent entire careers inside its walls and still speak of it with a kind of reverent surprise, as though the canyon keeps finding new ways to be extraordinary. In its full length, it crosses multiple ecosystems, multiple climates, and multiple worlds of color. What begins as pale cream limestone in one section deepens to crimson sandstone miles later, and then darkens further still, to the near black rock at its very deepest floor. The canyon is over a mile deep in places. Standing at the south rim, and looking straight down, the Colorado River appears as a thin silver thread, far, far below. It is easy to underestimate just how far down it actually is. The vertical distance from rim to river is over a mile in the deepest sections. To put that into a softer kind of picture, imagine stacking the world's tallest buildings on top of one another. Even then, you would barely reach the rim from the floor. The depth is so extreme that the climate at the bottom of the canyon is entirely different from the climate at the top. At the rim, the air is cool and thin, sometimes frosted with snow in winter. But descend into the inner canyon, and the temperature climbs sharply. The lower canyon holds heat like a cupped hand. In summer, the temperature at the river's edge can reach over 110 degrees. It is a place of extremes, compressed into a single vertical mile. Seasons stacked on top of seasons. Climates folded into one another like layers of a blanket. Many hikers who descend into the canyon describe the experience as traveling through multiple seasons in a single afternoon. They leave pine forests at the top, move through scrubby desert shrubs, pass through dry heat, and arrive eventually at the river, feeling as though they have walked into an entirely different part of the world. The Colorado River carved the canyon over 5 to 6 million years. Water, given enough time, can carve through almost anything. The Colorado River has been flowing through this landscape for somewhere between 5 and 6 million years. Long before the first humans walked the earth, the river was already at work, pressing downward through the rock, with the steady, patient force of moving water. It did not happen quickly. The canyon did not crack open in a single dramatic event. It deepened slowly, almost imperceptibly, year after year, century after century. A fraction of an inch here, a grain of rock there. The Colorado carries enormous amounts of sediment as it flows. Sand, grit, and tiny rock fragments suspended in the water. This sediment acts like sandpaper against the riverbed, grinding and smoothing and deepening the channel with every passing current. In this way, the river uses the very material it erodes is less than #0. 7.5 hash is greater than as a tool for further erosion. The process continues today. The Colorado is still carving, still pressing deeper, still doing the slow, quiet work it has always done. In 5 million more years, if conditions remain, the canyon may be deeper still, wider, more elaborate in its architecture. The river does not hurry. It simply continues. The rocks at the bottom of the canyon are nearly 2 billion years old. If you were somehow able to descend all the way to the canyon floor and press your hand against the dark schist at the base of the inner gorge, you would be touching some of the oldest exposed rock on the surface of the earth. These rocks, called the Vishnu basement rocks, are approximately 1.7 to 1.8 billion years old. That is nearly half the age of the planet itself. They formed deep within the earth, under tremendous pressure and heat, in a world that looked nothing like the one we know. There was no grass, no trees, no animals. The continents themselves were arranged in entirely different configurations. The sky held a different mixture of gases. And yet, these rocks were already forming, already hardening, already beginning their extraordinary weight. Above those ancient rocks, the canyon walls rise in distinct horizontal layers, each one representing a different chapter in the story of this land. Limestone that was once the floor of a warm, shallow sea. Sandstone that was once a vast drifting desert of dunes. Shale that was once the muddy bottom of a river delta. Each layer a different world, a different age, a different version of what Arizona once was. Reading the canyon's walls from bottom to top is like reading a library of time. Each stripe of color a separate volume. Each band of rock a chapter. Written not in words, but in sediment and mineral and patient geological memory. The Grand Canyon contains the great unconformity. Hidden within the canyon's layered walls is one of the most intriguing and mysterious features in all of geology. It is called the Great Unconformity. And it is, in essence, a gap in time. At a certain point in the canyon's layers, there is a contact between two groups of rock that are separated by roughly 1.2 billion years. On one side of that boundary, rock from one era. On the other side, rock from a completely different era. And the 1,200,000,000 years in between are simply missing. Gone. Eroded away. Vanished into ancient seas and winds, long before the canyon itself existed. Geologists have studied this gap for well over a century. It appears not just in the Grand Canyon, but in many other places across North America, and it remains one of the great, quiet puzzles of Earth science. What happened during that missing time? What was deposited, only to be worn entirely away? What worlds rose and fell in that vast, uncountable interval that left no trace behind? Standing at the Great Unconformity and knowing what it represents gives a particular kind of vertigo. Not the vertigo of height, but the vertigo of time. The dizzying realization that even the rock record, this seemingly complete archive of the Earth, has its silences, its lost chapters, its forgotten pages. The canyon was formed by a process called uplift as well as erosion. Most people understand that the Colorado River carved the Grand Canyon, but the river had help. Long before the canyon existed, this region of the Earth was undergoing a process known as tectonic uplift. The Colorado Plateau, the great flat highland on which the canyon sits, was slowly being pushed upward. The continent itself was rising. As the land elevated, the river found itself with a steeper gradient. More slope means more energy. More energy means faster, more powerful cutting. The uplift and the erosion worked together, the land rising as the river cut downward, each process amplifying the other. In a sense, the Grand Canyon is not just the work of water. It is the work of the whole earth moving. The slow continental forces that built mountains and shifted seas also shaped the canyon. The river was simply the chisel. The uplift was the hand that guided it. The canyon contains at least 6 distinct ecosystems. One of the quiet wonders of the Grand Canyon is how many different worlds exist within its walls. Because of the dramatic changes in elevation, temperature, and moisture, as you move from rim to river, the canyon holds multiple distinct ecosystems, often described as being comparable to traveling from Canada to Mexico within the space of a single vertical mile. At the North Rim, which sits at a higher elevation than the South Rim, dense forests of spruce and fir and aspen cover the plateau. It is cool and green and quiet here, with a feel more like the Rocky Mountains than the desert Southwest. Lower down, ponderosa pine forests give way to pinyon and juniper woodland. The trees grow shorter. The air grows drier. The light takes on a golden quality that is particular to high desert afternoons. Below that, the landscape opens into desert scrub, agave and yucca and cacti, hardy plants built for a world of little rain. And then, at the very bottom, near the river itself, cottonwood trees and willow grow thick along the banks is less than #0.75 hash is greater than fed by the steady water, creating a lush, narrow ribbon of green. In the middle of all that stone, each zone has its own creatures, its own birds, its own insects and reptiles and small mammals. The canyon does not contain just one kind of life. It contains multitudes. Over 1,500 species of plants call the Grand Canyon home. The diversity of plant life within the canyon is extraordinary by any measure. More than 1,500 species of vascular plants have been identified within the park's boundaries. From the tallest spruce on the North Rim to the tiny mosses that cling to wet canyon walls, near hidden seeps of water. Some of these plants are found almost nowhere else on Earth. Isolated within the canyon's unique conditions, they have evolved over long stretches of time into something slightly different from their relatives elsewhere. Small adaptations, quiet specializations, the kind of change that happens in a place when a population is left alone with its landscape long enough. The Havasu Canyon, a side canyon within the Grand Canyon system, contains a population of cottonwood and willow that have grown in ways specific to that canyon's particular light and moisture. In the driest inner canyon, certain cacti grow in crevices of rock, where rainwater collects just long enough to give them what they need. Life in the Grand Canyon is an exercise in ingenuity. Every plant there has made its peace with this landscape, found its niche, learned the particular language of rock and heat and thin desert rain. The California condor nearly vanished from Earth and was brought back in part because of the Grand Canyon. The California condor is one of the largest flying birds in North America. With a wingspan of up to 9.5 feet, it is a creature of extraordinary presence. And in the 1980s, it nearly ceased to exist. By 1987, the wild population of California condors had collapsed to just 22 birds. Poisoning from lead ammunition in carcasses, habitat loss, and human disturbance had brought one of North America's most ancient birds to the very edge of extinction. The decision was made to capture all remaining wild birds and begin a captive breeding program. For a few years, the California condor existed only in zoos. There were no wild ones left in the sky. Then came the slow work of recovery. By the early 1990s, captive-bred birds began to be reintroduced, and the Grand Canyon became one of the key release sites. The canyon offered exactly what condors need: vast open thermals of rising warm air to soar on, cliff faces for nesting, minimal human disturbance in many of its remote areas. Today, more than 500 California condors exist, with a significant wild population soaring above the Grand Canyon and surrounding region. To see one circling overhead, riding a thermal with its enormous wings perfectly still, is one of the quiet triumphs of conservation. A creature that almost vanished, returned to the sky above an ancient canyon, riding the same winds it has always known. The Grand Canyon has over 350 species of birds. Beyond the condor, the Grand Canyon is home to a remarkable variety of bird life. Over 350 species have been recorded within the park. From the common raven, whose dark, intelligent eyes watch visitors from nearly every overlook, to the secretive hermit thrush, whose flute-like song drifts through the pine forests of the rim on still mornings. The peregrine falcon nests on cliff faces within the canyon walls, using the same ledges that generations before it have used. It is one of the fastest creatures on Earth, capable of reaching speeds of over 200 miles per hour in a hunting dive. Yet in the canyon, it moves with a particular kind of ease, as though it was shaped specifically for this landscape of vertical stone. Tiny canyon wrens cling to sheer rock faces, their descending song cascading like water down the walls. Great blue herons stand motionless along the river's edge below. Violet-green swallows trace arcs through the warm canyon air. White-throated swifts move so fast they blur against the red stone. The canyon is never truly silent. Even in its quietest hours, something is always moving through its air. Something always singing, or calling, or simply gliding on the thermals that rise from its warm stone walls. The Colorado River runs through the canyon for 277 miles. The river that made the canyon is still very much alive within it. The Colorado runs its full length through the canyon system, moving through sections of furious white water and stretches of surprising calm. In some places, the river narrows between walls of dark ancient rock, and the current quickens, coiling and churning through the inner gorge. The rapids here have names that reflect their character: lava falls, crystal, granite, hermit. Each one a distinct personality of water and stone. In other places, the river opens into wide, calmer stretches, where sandbars form along the banks, and the water takes on a deep green color and moves with a quiet, almost meditative rhythm. River guides who spend their working seasons on the Colorado often describe a particular experience that comes somewhere in the middle of a long trip through the canyon. A sense of time dissolving, of the outside world becoming abstract and distant, with walls rising a mile on either side, and only the sound of water and wind and birds. The usual sense of urgency simply fades. The river teaches patience, in the way that only very old things can. The Grand Canyon was home to humans for at least 12,000 years. The canyon has not just been a place of rock and river. It has been a home. For at least 12,000 years, and possibly longer, people have lived in and around the Grand Canyon. The earliest inhabitants left behind split-twig figurines, small animal-shaped objects woven from single willow twigs, found deep within cave deposits in the canyon walls. These figurines are over 3,000 years old, and their purpose, whether ceremonial or practical or both, is still debated. Over the centuries, different peoples made the canyon their world. The ancestral Puebloans, sometimes called the Anasazi, built cliff dwellings in the canyon walls. Small rooms of carefully fitted stone, tucked into alcoves hundreds of feet above the canyon floor. They farmed, they traded, they watched the same stars we watch tonight. The Havasu people have lived in the canyon for at least 800 years. They refer to themselves as the people of the blue-green waters, a name that comes from the extraordinary turquoise-colored waterfalls is less than #0.75 is greater than that cascade through their corner of the canyon. Even today, the Havasu tribe lives within the canyon, in the village of Supai, which can only be reached on foot, by mule, or by helicopter. 11 affiliated tribes maintain connections to the Grand Canyon to this day. For these communities, the canyon is not a scenic attraction. It is ancestral land, a place of origin stories and sacred memory, woven deeply into who they are. The Havasu waterfalls are among the most beautiful places in North America. Tucked within the western reaches of the Grand Canyon, fed by springs that emerge from the limestone, are the falls of Havasu Creek. The water is a color that seems almost artificial at first glance. A vivid, luminous turquoise, nearly the color of a tropical sea, in the middle of a red desert canyon. The color comes from high concentrations of calcium carbonate and magnesium in the water. These minerals reflect light in a particular way that gives the creek and the falls their signature glow. Havasu Falls drops about 96 feet into a pool of that same impossible blue-green. Mooney Falls, named after a prospector who died near its cliff in the 1880s, drops nearly 200 feet. The mist from each fall catches the canyon light and holds it for a moment in small suspended rainbows. To reach these falls, you walk 8 miles through the dry heat of the canyon. The landscape is desert all around, brown and red and orange. And then, without warning, the sound of water reaches you, and you turn a corner, and there it is. that impossible color, that fall of water, that pool of turquoise in the middle of all that ancient stone. It is the kind of thing that makes people stop walking and simply stand still for a while. The Grand Canyon was made a national park in 1919. The story of how the Grand Canyon became protected land is one that involved decades of effort. In the late 1800s, as the American West was being settled and mined and logged, voices began to rise in defense of certain places. Places so extraordinary that turning them over entirely to resource extraction seemed like a kind of loss that could never be recovered from. President Theodore Roosevelt visited the south rim of the Grand Canyon in 1903. He stood at the edge and looked out, and said, reportedly, that it was beyond human power to improve upon it. He urged the people of Arizona not to do anything to mar its grandeur, to leave it as it was, for the ages. Roosevelt used the Antiquities Act to designate the canyon a national monument in 1908. Then, in 1919, is less than #075 is greater than Congress formally established the Grand Canyon National Park. Today, it is one of the most visited national parks in the United States, drawing nearly 5 million visitors each year. And yet, for all those visitors, for all those photographs taken and gasps heard at the rim, the canyon itself remains largely untouched. Below the established trails, beyond the overlooks and visitor centers, it is still the same wild, enormous, ancient place it has always been. The Grand Canyon has its own distinct weather patterns. A canyon of this size and depth does not simply sit passively inside the weather around it. It creates its own. The difference in elevation between the rim and the river floor means that warm air rising from the canyon depths creates localized updrafts and air movements that can differ entirely from what is happening on the plateau above. Thunderstorms can build rapidly over the rim in summer afternoons, while the inner canyon remains dry and still. Rain can fall from a storm at the rim and never reach the canyon floor, evaporating entirely in the hot, rising air below. One of the most remarkable weather events at the Grand Canyon is a phenomenon called a temperature inversion. Normally, air grows colder as you go higher. But during certain conditions, a layer of cold air becomes trapped below warmer air above it. When this happens at the Grand Canyon, the canyon fills with fog. Not ordinary fog. A complete, cloud-like sea of white, filling the canyon from wall to wall, with only the highest rims and buttes emerging above the surface. From the rim, it looks as though the canyon has been filled with a still white ocean, the towers of stone rising from it like islands. It happens only rarely, perhaps a handful of times in a decade. But those who witness it tend to describe it as one of the most surreal and beautiful things they have ever seen. The Grand Canyon at night is one of the darkest places in the American Southwest. During the day, the Grand Canyon belongs to color and heat and the cry of ravens. But after dark, it becomes something else entirely. The park is designated as an international dark sky park, one of the largest such designations in the world. Away from the few lit areas near visitor facilities, the darkness at the Grand Canyon is deep and complete. The kind of darkness that urban and suburban dwellers rarely experience. The kind of darkness where the Milky Way is not a faint smudge, but a vivid, luminous river spanning the entire sky. Astronomers have measured the darkness at the canyon's more remote reaches and found it among the least light-polluted in the continental United States. On moonless nights is less than #0. 75 is greater than the star-filled sky reflects off the pale limestone surfaces of the canyon walls and gives everything a faint, ghostly luminescence. Campers who spend nights in the backcountry of the canyon often mention the sky as one of the most unexpected experiences of the trip. They come for the canyon. They stay awake, watching the stars move overhead. Ancient rock below them, ancient light above, and themselves somewhere in the middle, small and quiet and strangely content. The inner canyon has a unique geological feature called the Tapeats sandstone. As you descend the canyon walls through their layers, each band of rock tells a different story. Some of those stories are familiar. Marine limestone from ancient seas, wind-blown sandstone from ancient dunes. But one layer deserves particular attention for what it represents and how it looks. The Tapeats sandstone is a distinctive brown layer that sits just above the great unconformity we spoke of earlier. It was deposited roughly 525 million years ago, during the Cambrian period, when the first complex animal life was beginning to emerge in the world's oceans. At the time the Tapeats was being laid down, this region of the Earth was covered by a shallow tropical sea. The sand that settled to its floor over millions of years was eventually compressed into stone. And in that stone, embedded in some sections, are trace fossils, the burrows and tracks of ancient creatures, moving through the sea floor 500 million years ago. Not bones or shells, just trails, the quiet evidence of movement, of life going about its business, in a sea that no longer exists, on a continent that looked nothing like the one we stand on. Fossils found in the canyon walls span hundreds of millions of years. The Grand Canyon is not a place typically associated with dramatic fossil discoveries, the way certain badlands and bone beds are. But its walls hold an extraordinary and quiet fossil record that spans enormous stretches of time. The limestones of the upper canyon walls, deposited in shallow marine environments, contain the remains of ancient sea creatures. Crinoids, which are feathery animals related to starfish and sea urchins. Brachiopods, shellfish that lived on the sea floor. Corals, sponges, the ghostly impressions of creatures whose descendants still swim in the ocean today, though the creatures themselves vanished hundreds of millions of years ago. The Hermit Shale, a red layer visible in the upper canyon walls, was deposited in a swampy delta environment around 280 million years ago. Within it, geologists have found fossilized tracks of reptiles and amphibians is less than #0. 75 # is greater than walking across ancient mudflats. Some of these creatures were among the earliest land vertebrates to leave an enduring record of their passing. These are not dramatic scenes, just footprints in what was once mud, the casual evidence of an animal crossing from one place to another on an afternoon 280 million years ago. Unaware, of course, that its steps would be preserved in stone for longer than it was possible to imagine. The North Rim and the South Rim are only 10 miles apart, but 1,000 feet different in elevation. If you were a bird, crossing the Grand Canyon would take only a few minutes. The two rims face each other across a distance of roughly 10 miles at the canyon's narrowest points. But for a person on the ground, reaching the other rim means a descent of more than a mile, a river crossing, and a climb back up the other side. A journey that typically takes 2 full days. The North Rim stands about 1,000 feet higher than the South Rim. This difference in elevation gives the two sides of the canyon entirely different characters. The North Rim is cooler and wetter. It receives more snow in winter and is closed to visitors from mid-autumn through spring, when the access road becomes impassable. Because of its limited accessibility, the North Rim sees far fewer visitors than the South. In a park that draws millions is less than .75 is greater than the North Rim, remains relatively quiet. Its trails less worn, its overlooks more often empty. It is, by accident of geography, one of the more solitary places you can stand in a busy national park. Those who have visited both rims often say the North feels different in a way that is hard to articulate. Older, perhaps. Quieter, as though it is waiting for something that never quite arrives. The Colorado River once ran free, but is now controlled by dams. The Colorado River that carved the Grand Canyon was once an unconstrained force of nature. It flooded violently in spring as snowmelt poured off the Rocky Mountains. It ran low and clear in late summer. It carried enormous loads of sediment that it deposited in shifting bars and deltas, all the way to the Gulf of California. The construction of Hoover Dam in the 1930s and Glen Canyon Dam in the 1960s fundamentally changed the river. Upstream of the Grand Canyon, Lake Powell formed behind Glen Canyon Dam, capturing the sediment that once flowed freely through the canyon. The river that runs through the Grand Canyon today is colder than it once was, because it is released from deep within the reservoir rather than warmed by the desert sun. It carries less sediment. It no longer floods naturally. The seasonal rhythms that shaped the canyon's ecology for millions of years is less than .75 is greater than have been altered. This has had complex effects. Some native fish species have struggled in the changed conditions. The sandbars and beaches within the canyon have diminished without the sediment that once replenished them. Scientists and managers now conduct controlled flood releases from the dam periodically, in an attempt to mimic the natural patterns of the past and restore some of what has been lost. The river is not what it was, but it continues, still flowing, still carving, still working its patient way through the rock, as it always has. The humpback chub has lived in the Colorado River for millions of years. Among the river's native inhabitants, one fish holds a particular place in the story of the Grand Canyon. The humpback chub is a strange-looking creature, with a pronounced fleshy hump behind its head, and a body designed for the fast, turbulent water of the inner canyon. It evolved in the Colorado River system over millions of years, shaped by the particular conditions of that ecosystem. The turbid, warm, sediment-heavy water, the fierce rapids, and the calmer backwaters. Every feature of its body is a response to the world it developed in. When the dams changed the river, the humpback chub found itself struggling. The colder, clearer water favored non-native trout species that had been introduced for sport fishing. The chub population declined sharply. Today, it is listed as a threatened species. Conservation efforts within the Grand Canyon have focused in part on protecting the warm water refuges inside canyons, where the chub can still find conditions closer to those it evolved in. In the Little Colorado River, a warm turquoise tributary that enters the main canyon from the east, the chub still spawns. Still swims in the water it has always known. It is an ancient fish in an ancient river, both of them shaped by the same canyon, both of them carrying its history in their nature. The Little Colorado River runs a brilliant turquoise color in certain conditions. The Little Colorado River is one of the most important tributaries of the main Colorado within the canyon system. For most of the year, it runs milky blue-green, colored by the same minerals that give the Havasu waterfalls their extraordinary hue. When the spring floods come and the Little Colorado runs high and fast, it turns brown and turbid. But in its calmer, clearer phases, it runs a color that seems to belong more to a tropical reef than to a desert canyon. A vivid aquamarine, a blue so saturated it looks painted. This stretch of the river is sacred to the Hopi people, who call it the Sipapu. In Hopi tradition, the Sipapu is the place of emergence, the opening through which humanity entered this world. A rounded travertine dome sits at the edge of the river in this area, formed by the same calcium-rich water that gives it its color. In the landscape of Hopi cosmology, this unremarkable-looking mound of mineral deposit marks the threshold between worlds, the beginning of human existence, the first breath of this world. That such a place exists quietly in the depths of a canyon, known to relatively few, visited by fewer still, gives it a particular kind of weight. The Grand Canyon walls change color depending on the time of day. One of the things that keeps artists and photographers returning to the Grand Canyon again and again is that it is never the same twice. Or rather, it is the same and entirely different, depending on the light. At sunrise, the canyon walls on the eastern faces catch the first light. The rock glows in shades of apricot and rose and copper. Shadows still fill the inner gorge, creating a sense of tremendous depth. The light is soft and horizontal, raking across the textured stone and revealing every detail of erosion and layer. By midday, the high sun washes out the color. The canyon becomes paler, flatter, less dramatic. This is the time most photographers consider the least interesting, and yet there is something honest about it. The canyon in plain light, simply itself. At sunset, the transformation is extraordinary. The western light turns the canyon to fire. The reds deepen, the oranges saturate. The purple shadows pool in the lower gorges, while the upper walls still burn with warmth. For perhaps 15 minutes around true sunset, the canyon seems to generate its own light, as though the rock itself is luminous. Then the color cools. The shadows rise. The canyon darkens from the bottom up, like ink spreading slowly through water. And then the stars come. Phantom Ranch is the only lodging at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. Deep within the canyon, near the point where Bright Angel Creek meets the Colorado River, there is a small collection of stone buildings. Cabins, a canteen, a dormitory, a few cottonwood trees growing tall and green beside the creek. This is Phantom Ranch. It is the only lodging facility within the canyon itself, reachable only by foot, by mule, or by river raft. The original buildings were designed by the architect Mary Coulter and completed in the early 1920s. They are built of the same stone that surrounds them, low and modest and perfectly suited to the landscape. Spending the night at Phantom Ranch is considered by many who have done it to be one of the most remarkable sleep experiences they have ever had. A mile below the rim, the creek sounds outside the window, the canyon walls rising in darkness on all sides. The stars, if you step outside, are directly overhead and nothing else. There is no phone signal at Phantom Ranch. No internet. No traffic. No city sound. Just the water and the wind, and the vast, dark, unhurried quiet of a very old place. Mail is still delivered to Phantom Ranch by mule. Among the more quietly charming details of life at the canyon's bottom is the mail system. For nearly a century, mail destined for Phantom Ranch has been carried in by mule train. The mules descend the Bright Angel Trail from the South Rim, carrying supplies and correspondence on their backs, as they always have. Letters sent from Phantom Ranch carry a special stamp that marks them as delivered by mule. A small and lovely detail. In an age when nearly everything moves through digital channels, receiving a postcard stamped at Phantom Ranch means receiving something that traveled down into one of the great natural wonders of the world, on the back of an animal, then climbed back out again, all to reach your mailbox. The mule teams themselves have become part of the canyon's story. Canyon mules are selected for their calm temperament and sure footing. They have been walking these trails for generations. Some of them know the path so well that they navigate the narrowest switchbacks without any visible hesitation. On the narrowest section of the Bright Angel Trail, the mule's outer hoof can be inches from the edge of a sheer drop. They do not flinch. They simply walk, patient and deliberate and entirely at home. The Grand Canyon is still being explored. Given how many millions of people have visited the Grand Canyon, it might seem like every corner of it has been mapped and catalogued. But the canyon is larger than it appears, and much of it is nearly inaccessible. The maze of side canyons, slot canyons, and remote plateaus within the park contains areas rarely visited by humans, sections of wall where new fossils are still being found, springs that emerge from the rock in remote locations, supporting small communities of plants and insects, still being documented by scientists. Biological surveys in recent decades have continued to find species within the canyon that were not previously recorded there. Cave systems within the canyon walls have yielded Ice Age fossils of extinct animals, including ground sloths and condors and horses, preserved in the dry darkness for thousands of years. The canyon is too large to know fully. Its history too long. Its complexity too layered. Every expedition into its more remote reaches is less than #0.75 is greater than has the chance of finding something that changes a small piece of what we know. In this way, the Grand Canyon remains, quietly and without announcement, a place of ongoing discovery. The canyon contains caves that have preserved ancient life. Within the walls of the Grand Canyon are hundreds of caves. Some are small and shallow. Others are long winding passages that extend deep into the limestone. These caves have served as natural cold storage for biological material over thousands and even tens of thousands of years. The dry, cool, stable conditions within them have preserved organic matter that would long ago have decayed in almost any other environment. In several canyon caves, researchers have found the desiccated remains of Shasta ground sloths, large, plant-eating mammals that lived in this region until roughly 11,000 years ago. Clumps of their dung, tufts of their hair, even partial hides. These are not fossils in the traditional sense. They are actual organic material, preserved by the cave's conditions for over 10,000 years. The dung of the ground sloths has been analyzed in detail, revealing what plants they were eating in the canyon, in the millennia before they disappeared. In this way, the caves have allowed us to know not just that these animals existed here is less than #0.75 is greater than but what they tasted, what they sought out, what the canyon looked like to them as they moved through it. The ancestral Puebloans built granaries inside the canyon walls. In the centuries before the canyon was known to European explorers, the ancestral Puebloans were building within it. And not just homes. Storage. Small, precisely constructed stone granaries have been found tucked into alcoves on the canyon walls at various heights. Some are barely accessible, reachable only by handholds and footholds worn into the rock. They were placed in these difficult locations deliberately. The height and inaccessibility would have kept them safe from animals and from raiding parties. Inside these granaries, when they have been carefully excavated, archaeologists have found the remains of corn, squash, and other crops. Small amounts, carefully stored. The evidence of agricultural communities that were managing their food supply with considerable skill in one of the most demanding landscapes in North America. Some of these granaries are still intact after nearly 1,000 years. The stone fitting tight, the mortar holding, the dry canyon air having done what the builders perhaps hoped it would, kept things safe, kept things waiting. The canyon records the story of ancient oceans that covered this land. It is difficult to stand in the red desert of northern Arizona and imagine it beneath a sea. And yet the canyon walls tell exactly that story, over and over, in different layers, from different eras. The Redwall limestone, that enormous cliff-forming layer of dark grey rock, stained red on its exterior by iron washed down from the layers above, was deposited in a shallow tropical sea approximately 340 million years ago. At that time, the land we now call Arizona sat near the equator. The climate was warm and wet. Coral reefs grew in the shallow water. Crinoids waved their feathery arms in the current. Sharks swam over what is now red desert. The limestone that formed from those ancient seabeds is now a vertical wall of rock, standing in the middle of the Sonoran Desert, nearly 500 miles from the nearest ocean. There is something deeply calming about that kind of perspective. The reminder that the world we see around us is not the only version of the world that has been. That this land has been ocean and desert and mountain and sea floor, and will likely be something else again, in the long, slow turning of geological time. The Grand Canyon holds records of ancient magnetic field reversals. Embedded within certain layers of the canyon's rock is a record of something invisible to the eye. The history of Earth's magnetic field. When volcanic rock cools and solidifies, magnetic minerals within it align themselves with the direction of the Earth's magnetic field at that moment. They are frozen in place as the rock hardens, preserving the magnetic orientation of their time. The Grand Canyon contains volcanic features, including lava flows that entered the canyon from the rim in relatively recent geological time, perhaps only a few 100,000 years ago. These flows recorded the magnetic field at the time of their cooling. And by studying them, geologists have been able to confirm the history of magnetic reversals, periods when the Earth's north and south magnetic poles switched positions. These reversals happen irregularly, over periods of thousands of years. The last one occurred roughly 780,000 years ago. During a reversal, compasses would point south instead of north. The magnetic shield that protects Earth from solar radiation weakens. The aurora might be visible in unexpected places. The canyon holds this record quietly in its rocks. A diary of the planet's deep interior, written in magnetic minerals, waiting in the stone for someone to know how to read it. Ancient lava flows tried to dam the Colorado River. In the western portion of the Grand Canyon, there is evidence of one of the more dramatic episodes in the canyon's recent geological history. Volcanic eruptions from vents along the canyon rim sent rivers of lava cascading over the edge and down the walls. Some of these lava flows reached the Colorado River, and they were large enough to dam it. The Colorado backed up behind these natural lava dams, forming lakes deep within the canyon. Some of these lakes may have extended for dozens or even hundreds of miles upstream. A hidden inland sea in the middle of the desert, hemmed in by walls of stone and cooled lava. But the river is patient and the river is strong. Over time, the water found its way through and around the dams. It eroded the lava. It cut new channels. It reclaimed its path. The evidence of these ancient dams is still visible in the canyon. Columns of dark volcanic rock, clinging to the canyon walls at heights above the current river level, the remnants of lava that once stood as walls against the water. The river won. It always does, given enough time. The canyon's colors come from minerals in the rock. The Grand Canyon is famous for its color, but the colors are not simply decorative. Each one is a signature of the minerals present in each layer of rock, a chemical fingerprint of the conditions under which that layer formed. The reds and oranges come primarily from iron oxide, the same chemistry that gives rust its color. Iron-bearing minerals within the rock were exposed to oxygen is less than #0. 7.5 is greater than and gradually oxidized over millions of years, staining the stone with warm tones. The creamy, white, and pale yellow layers are often limestone or sandstone, with lower iron content. Pure calcium carbonate tends toward white and gray. Sand grains cemented with silica tend toward pale tan. The greens and grays come from other mineral combinations, often involving iron in its less oxidized state, or from the presence of organic material within the sediment. The Redwall limestone is actually gray. Its red exterior comes from iron-rich material washing down from the red layers above it and staining its surface over millions of years. Strip away the outer coating, and you find gray limestone beneath. The canyon is painted by chemistry, by the patient work of minerals reacting with water and oxygen and time. Each color a story of the conditions that existed when that rock was young. A geological autobiography, written in iron and calcium and silicon, and the long, slow language of the earth. Ravens are among the most intelligent residents of the Grand Canyon. If there is one creature that seems to belong to the Grand Canyon the way the stone and the sky belong to it, it is the common raven. Ravens are everywhere at the south rim. They hop along the walls of overlooks. They perch on the rooftops of visitor buildings. They circle in thermals above the rim with a casual mastery is less than #0. 7.5 is greater than that would take a human pilot years to acquire. They are also extraordinarily intelligent. Ravens are among the most cognitively capable birds on Earth. They can solve multi-step problems. They demonstrate something very close to planning ahead. They recognize individual human faces and appear to remember people who have been kind to them or threatening to them. At the Grand Canyon, ravens have developed an understanding of human behavior that serves them well. They know that backpacks often contain food. They know that a distracted tourist is an opportunity. They have been observed working in pairs, one raven distracting a visitor, while another investigates their belongings. Native American traditions across the Southwest have long recognized the raven as a creature of intelligence and trickery, a being that lives at the intersection of the ordinary and the mysterious. Standing at the canyon rim at dusk and watching a raven drop from the edge into the vast dark below, riding a thermal downward and then upward with no visible effort, it is easy to understand why. The Grand Canyon produces its own unique sound environment. Sound behaves differently in the Grand Canyon. The vast open amphitheater of the canyon, with its parallel walls and enormous empty airspace, creates acoustic effects that visitors often notice without quite being able to name. Thunder inside the canyon does not rumble and fade the way it does in open country. It bounces between the walls, building into a rolling, sustained reverberation that can last for many seconds after the original crack. The wind, moving through side canyons and alcoves, produces tones, low humming resonances that change in pitch as the wind changes direction. Some visitors have described particular locations in the inner canyon where the wind produces sounds that feel almost like music. And the silence, when it comes, is a particular kind of silence. The canyon is deep enough and wide enough that human sounds from the rim do not carry to the floor. And in remote sections of the inner canyon, away from the river's white noise, the quiet is as complete as any you will find anywhere on Earth. Scientists who study natural silence, the absence not just of human noise but of all noise, have identified the backcountry of the Grand Canyon as one of the last truly quiet places in the American West. To stand in that silence, with a mile of rock above you and the faint sound of water somewhere below, is one of those rare experiences that stays with people for the rest of their lives. The canyon walls hold the story of the supercontinent Rodinia. Deeper in the canyon's geological story is less than #0.75 is greater than in the very oldest rocks near the floor. There are traces of a world almost unrecognizable from our own. Long before the current arrangement of continents existed, the Earth's landmasses were assembled in a different configuration. One of the earliest supercontinents, known as Rodinia, existed roughly 1 billion years ago, when the rocks now visible in the canyon's inner gorge were being formed. Rodinia looked nothing like the world we know. The continents we now call North America, Europe, Asia, and others were fused together into one vast landmass, surrounded by a single great ocean. The Vishnu schist at the canyon's base was formed by the collisions of tectonic plates that assembled this ancient supercontinent. The heat and pressure of those collisions transformed existing rock into the dark, crystalline, contorted material, visible today at the bottom of the inner gorge. This rock has been through more than most of us can imagine. Born in the collision of continents, buried, compressed, heated, then slowly exhumed over hundreds of millions of years by the patient work of erosion, until it sits today, exposed and visible, at the bottom of a river canyon in Arizona. The Grand Canyon inspires a particular kind of wonder that scientists have studied. There is a word that psychologists have begun using to describe what people feel is less than .0. 75 hash is greater than when confronted with something vast and beyond their ordinary experience. The word is awe. Awe is not simply admiration or appreciation. It is something more specific. It involves a moment of being overwhelmed by scale or complexity, a recognition that the world is larger than one's mental models of it. Researchers have found that experiences of awe have measurable effects on well-being. They reduce feelings of anxiety. They decrease the sense of self-importance that often underlies stress. They increase feelings of connectedness to others and to the world. They even appear to slow the subjective experience of time. The Grand Canyon is one of the most reliable inducers of awe on Earth. Studies of visitors at the rim have found that people report feeling small, quiet, and strangely peaceful in the presence of the canyon. Not diminished, not frightened, but settled, as though some habitual tension has been temporarily released. The canyon does something to people, something that is difficult to fully articulate, but consistently reported. A kind of recalibration, a returning to proportion. A reminder that you are a small thing in a very large world, and that this is, actually, an enormous relief. The Grand Canyon contains a place called Elves chasm. In the lower reaches of the Grand Canyon, accessible only by river, is less than .0. 75 hash is greater than there is a place that river guides have been returning to for generations. It is called Elves chasm. To reach it, you pull a raft into a small side canyon and wade a short distance upstream through knee-deep water. The walls of the side canyon close in around you, narrowing to a slot no more than a few feet wide in places. And then the canyon opens slightly, and you find yourself in a small hidden room of stone. A waterfall drops perhaps 30 feet into a pool of green water. Maidenhair ferns hang from the wet walls in curtains of soft green. Mosses cover every surface that stays damp. The light comes from a narrow strip of sky far above. The sound here is entirely of water. The fall itself, and the trickle of seeps from the walls, and the gentle lapping of the pool. Nothing else reaches this place. Not wind, not voices from outside, not any sound that belongs to the world beyond the canyon walls. River guides who have made the Grand Canyon their livelihood often name Elves chasm as one of the places that keeps them coming back. Not the famous rapids, not the towering walls of the inner gorge, but this small, hidden, dripping room of green and stone that feels like a secret the canyon only shares with those who travel the river. The Bright Angel Trail has been used for thousands of years. The most famous trail descending into the Grand Canyon from the South Rim is less than #0.75 is greater than is the Bright Angel Trail. It drops nearly 5,000 feet over roughly 9 miles, switching back and forth across the canyon face in a series of long descending traverses. But the trail is not a modern invention. The path was used by the Havasu people for centuries before European settlers arrived. They followed game trails and their own worn routes, up and down the canyon walls, moving between the rim and the inner canyon, with a familiarity born of generations of use. When prospectors and early tourists arrived in the late 1800s, they widened these existing paths and added rough improvements. The trail that hikers use today still follows largely the same line. Those original paths cut across the canyon face. There are 2 rest houses along the trail where hikers can find water and shade. The first, at 1.5 Mile Rest House, offers a view back up to the rim that already makes the world above feel distant. The second, Indian Garden, now called Havasu Gardens after its original name was restored, sits in a small oasis of cottonwood trees, about 4.5 miles down. In the shade of those cottonwoods, in the middle of a hot afternoon, with your feet resting and the canyon walls rising on all sides, there is an extraordinary stillness. The sky above is a narrow strip of blue. The leaves move in a small wind. The world of roads and phones and schedules seems to belong to another dimension entirely. The canyon walls hold imprints of ancient ripples. In some of the sandstone layers of the Grand Canyon, if you look closely at the surface of the rock, you can see something remarkable preserved in perfect detail. Ripples. The gentle, undulating patterns made by water or wind moving across sand, hundreds of millions of years ago, are still visible in the stone. The same shapes you might see on a beach today, the lazy corrugations left by a retreating wave, or the riffling pattern left by a shallow current, were captured in the ancient sediment before it hardened into rock. Some of these ripple marks are from the floors of ancient seas. Others are from desert dunes, where wind rather than water created the patterns. In either case, the preservation is so precise that you can see the direction the current or wind was moving. On a particular afternoon, several 100 million years ago. There is something deeply peaceful about this detail. The idea that a moment as ordinary as water washing across sand could be preserved across such a vast span of time. That the everyday texture of an ancient world is still there, still readable, under your fingertips if you reach out and touch the wall. The Grand Canyon is one of the few places on Earth where you can see a mile of geology at a glance. Most geological formations are understood only in pieces. You find one layer here, another layer miles away. You assemble the story gradually, from scattered evidence, over years of fieldwork. The Grand Canyon is different. At the South Rim, you can stand in one place and look at a continuous vertical section of rock that spans nearly 2 billion years. From the cream-colored Kaibab limestone at your feet to the dark Vishnu schist at the river far below, the entire sequence is exposed, intact, and readable. This is extraordinarily rare. Normally, rock layers are buried under newer deposits, or tilted and fractured by geological forces, or covered by soil and vegetation. But the canyon's specific combination of uplift and erosion has created a window into the deep past that is unmatched almost anywhere else on Earth. Geology students come to the Grand Canyon the way medical students come to great teaching hospitals. Not because it is the most exotic example of its kind, but because it is the clearest, the most legible, the place where the story of the Earth is written in the most readable hand. The canyon was once home to woolly mammoths. During the last ice age, the world around the Grand Canyon was a different place. The climate was cooler and wetter. The plateau above the canyon was forested more extensively. Water was more plentiful. And the canyon and its surrounding region supported a range of large mammals that are now extinct. Woolly mammoths moved through this landscape. So did mastodons, giant ground sloths, some as large as modern elephants, browsed the vegetation of the canyon's upper slopes. Horses, which had evolved in North America and would later go extinct here only to be reintroduced by the Spanish, grazed the plateau grasslands. American camels walked through country that would one day become the Colorado Plateau. Dire wolves and American lions hunted across the same landscape. All of this was happening while the canyon itself was already a significant feature. These animals would have come to its rim, would have found their way down to the river when conditions allowed, would have sheltered in its inner recesses. During cold spells, the canyon witnessed their presence, and then witnessed their disappearance. Each species, a chapter in the canyon's biography. Each extinction, another layer of silence, added to its deep and patient memory. The canyon contains a layer called the Coconino sandstone that was once a Sahara-like desert. One of the most distinctive layers in the Grand Canyon's walls is a pale, cream-colored band of sandstone found near the upper canyon walls. It is called the Coconino sandstone, is less than #0.75 hash is greater than, and it was deposited roughly 275 million years ago. At that time, this region of the Earth was a vast desert, not the scrubby high desert that exists here today, but something closer to the Sahara or the great sand seas of Arabia. Enormous dunes, some hundreds of feet tall, stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. The Coconino preserves the internal structure of those dunes. Look closely at the rock, and you can see the cross-bedded layers, the gentle diagonal lines left by sand grains cascading down the faces of ancient dunes. These patterns are frozen in stone, a photograph of moving sand, taken 275 million years ago. Within the Coconino, there are fossil tracks. Small reptiles walked across the dune faces, their footprints pressed into the sand, dried in the sun, and were eventually covered by more sand and preserved. The trails they left behind suggest they were moving uphill across the dune face, the way a lizard might move today, in a desert environment, unaware that their morning walk across a wind-blown hill of sand would still be readable nearly 300 million years later. The Grand Canyon has a sister canyon that is barely known. Most people who know the Grand Canyon have never heard of Canyonlands National Park's Maze District is less than #0.75 is greater than or of the equally extraordinary slot canyons of the Colorado Plateau. But within the broader canyon country of the American Southwest, the Grand Canyon is part of a family. Its closest geographic relative, in a sense, is Glen Canyon. Before it was flooded by Lake Powell, Glen Canyon was considered by many who saw it to be even more beautiful than the Grand Canyon in certain respects. More intimate, more intricate, its walls closer together, its side canyons more numerous and more easily explored. The naturalist and writer Edward Abbey mourned the loss of Glen Canyon as one of the great tragedies in American environmental history, a place of extraordinary beauty, drowned under hundreds of feet of reservoir water, before most people had ever seen it. Now, as Lake Powell has dropped to historically low levels, due to drought and increased water demand, portions of Glen Canyon have re-emerged from the water. Side canyons once submerged have reappeared, still holding in places the natural features that made them remarkable. The canyon country does not give up its memory easily. Even underwater, it waits. The canyon has inspired some of the most important conservation thinking in American history. The story of how the Grand Canyon was protected is not just a story about one canyon. It is a story about how a society begins to think differently is less than #0.75 is greater than about its relationship with the natural world. Before the conservation movement, the prevailing attitude toward wild land in America was that it existed to be used. Mined, logged, grazed, farmed. Value was understood primarily as extractive value. What could the land produce? What could be taken from it? The Grand Canyon challenged that thinking. It was so obviously extraordinary, so clearly irreplaceable, so far beyond what any industrial use could justify taking, that it forced a new question. What if some things were worth more left alone? John Muir visited the canyon and wrote about it in terms that were new to American writing about land. Not as a resource, not as a commodity, but as something sacred, as something that had intrinsic value, independent of its usefulness to humans. Roosevelt's famous words at the rim, urging people to leave it unimproved, echoed a growing sentiment that would eventually give rise to the national park system, environmental law, and a whole tradition of thinking about the rights of non-human nature. The canyon, in other words, did not just teach geology. It taught values. It helped a civilization understand that beauty and antiquity and ecological complexity were things worth protecting, not because they were useful, but because their loss would diminish us. The Grand Canyon is visited by people from almost every country in the world. Every year, Nearly 5 million people come to stand at the edge of the Grand Canyon. They come from almost every nation on Earth, from countries whose own landscapes are flat and featureless, from countries that have their own extraordinary landscapes, from cities and towns and places with no word in their language for what they are about to see. They arrive at the rim and they stop. Almost universally, the reaction is the same across cultures and languages and backgrounds. A catching of the breath, a silence, a long moment of simply looking. The canyon requires no translation. It communicates something directly, without words, that is understood by every human nervous system, regardless of language or culture. Something vast and real is before you. Something older than anything you have ever encountered. Something that has been here since before your species existed, and will be here long after it has gone. Stand here and be quiet. That is all it asks. Stand here and be quiet, and let yourself be small for a while. The desert varnish on canyon walls is made by microorganisms. On the faces of many canyon walls, particularly the older, darker surfaces, there is a distinctive dark coating. A thin, hard, shiny layer of deep brown or near black material that covers the rock like a patina. This is called desert varnish. For a long time, geologists assumed it was simply the result of minerals being deposited on the rock surface by water. But research in recent decades has revealed something more surprising. Desert varnish is in significant part the work of microorganisms. Communities of bacteria and other microbes live on the surfaces of canyon walls. They concentrate manganese and iron from the surrounding environment and deposit it on the rock surface as part of their metabolic processes. Over thousands of years, these deposits build up into the distinctive dark coating. The process is extraordinarily slow. The thickest desert varnish represents thousands of years of microbial activity. These tiny communities working generation after generation, leaving a trace of their existence on the face of the stone. And on this surface, the people who lived in this canyon before us left their own marks. Petroglyphs, images carved through the varnish to reveal the lighter rock beneath, are found throughout the canyon system. Spirals, human figures, animals, patterns whose meaning we can only guess at. Microbial life and human imagination, both leaving their marks on the same ancient stone. The canyon holds the record of 5 mass extinction events. Earth has experienced 5 major mass extinction events in its history. Moments when large proportions of living species were wiped out in relatively short periods of geological time. The canyon's walls span a time range that includes several of these events. The Permian-Triassic extinction, the largest mass extinction ever recorded, which occurred approximately 252 million years ago, and eliminated more than 90% of marine species, falls within the time frame represented by the upper canyon layers. The rocks do not announce this event dramatically. There is no visible scar, no obvious boundary in the stone. But to a trained geologist, the fossil assemblages change at that boundary. Species that were abundant in one layer are simply absent from the layer above, gone from the record, gone from the world. The canyon witnessed the end of worlds and the beginning of new ones, over and over, without catastrophe from its own perspective, simply continuing to be, to accept sediment, to record what happened, to keep its patient account of everything the earth went through. The springs and seeps within the canyon are ecological oases. Water in the Grand Canyon does not only arrive through rainfall and the river, it also emerges from within the rock itself. Rainwater that falls on the Colorado Plateau seeps into the porous limestone of the canyon's upper layers. It travels slowly, very slowly, through the rock, following cracks and passages, sometimes taking decades to travel just a few hundred feet. Eventually, this water reaches impermeable layers and emerges from the canyon walls as springs or seeps, sometimes as a thin film of water on the rock face, barely visible but enough to support a curtain of maidenhair fern, sometimes as a small, clear trickle emerging from a crack in the stone into the dry canyon air. Around every spring and seep, life concentrates. These are oases in a landscape of rock and heat. Monkey flowers bloom in impossible pinks. Small frogs breed in the pools. Butterflies gather on the wet rock. Birds stop to drink and bathe. In the broader dryness of the inner canyon, these tiny, wet spots are enormously important. They function as waypoints and refuges for every creature that moves through the canyon's demanding terrain. Little worlds of moisture and green in the middle of all that stone and heat. The Grand Canyon has a winter face very few people see. Most images of the Grand Canyon show it in the warm tones of summer or autumn, the reds and oranges of the rock, the blue sky, the haze in the distance. But the canyon in winter is a different thing entirely. Snow falls on the south rim through winter months. It settles on the ledges of the canyon walls. It fills the hollows of the red rock, and the contrast between the white snow and the deep reds and purples of the stone creates a palette that feels almost impossible. Looking down into the canyon on a winter morning after a fresh snowfall, you might see the upper walls dusted with white, while the inner gorge below is still brown and dry in the desert warmth. The snow line has an exact edge, a clear boundary between the cold world above and the desert world below. Winter visits to the Grand Canyon are far quieter than summer ones. The crowds thin dramatically. The south rim, which is open year-round, becomes a more solitary place. The ravens seem more present, more willing to linger near the overlooks, as though they prefer the company. When fewer people are watching, there are mornings in January when you can stand at Mather Point, in the cold, still air, and feel entirely alone with the canyon. No sound but the wind, no movement but the ravens, the canyon holding its cold winter silence, as completely as it holds everything else. The canyon contains ruins of a watchtower built to look ancient. At Desert View, on the eastern end of the South Rim Drive, there stands a stone tower is less than #0.75 is greater than that appears at first glance to be an ancient ruin. Its rough stone construction, its narrow windows, its commanding position at the canyon's edge, all of it suggests a building of great age. In fact, it was built in 1932. Designed by the architect Mary Coulter, who was one of the most important figures in shaping the visual character of the Grand Canyon's built environment. Coulter designed the Desert View Watchtower to look as though it had been there for centuries. She studied ruins of actual ancient towers throughout the Southwest and incorporated their proportions and construction methods into her design. She sourced stone from the surrounding landscape. She used authentic construction techniques. Inside the tower, she worked with the Hopi artist Fred Cabote to create murals based on traditional Hopi imagery. The interior feels sacred and old, a deliberate evocation of a living cultural tradition. The tower is not a fake. It is a thoughtful act of imagination and respect, a building that asks you to remember the long human presence at this place before the first tourist ever arrived. The canyon holds stories in its silence as much as in its rock. There is a quality to the Grand Canyon that resists being fully captured in words or photographs. Every person who has tried to describe it has eventually arrived at the same conclusion: that the description is inadequate, that the actual experience contains something that simply does not survive translation. Part of it is scale. The canyon is so large that your visual system cannot process it as a single object. You see one part, then another, then another. You scan. You search for an edge that never quite resolves. Part of it is depth. The eye keeps traveling downward, and the distance keeps being larger than expected. And part of it, perhaps, is time. The consciousness that what you are looking at is not just a landscape, but a chronicle. That the walls themselves are a record of everything that came before. When you are there, standing at the rim in the quiet of early morning, before the tour buses arrive and the day fills with voices, the canyon has a presence. A weight, not threatening, not ominous. Simply the weight of something immensely old, existing alongside you. The silence of the Grand Canyon is not empty. It is full. Full of what has been. Full of what remains. Full of the unspoken knowledge that this place was here long before any voice spoke of it, and will be here long after all voices have gone quiet. The canyon is expanding slowly even now. The carving of the Grand Canyon did not stop when geologists began studying it. It has not paused for visitors or for photographs. It continues, quietly and without ceremony, in the way that geological processes always continue. Every rainstorm that falls on the canyon rim sends water running down into the canyon, carrying particles of rock with it. Every winter, freeze and spring thaw works at the cracks in the canyon walls, prying rock apart, in a process called frost weathering. Boulders that have clung to the canyon walls for thousands of years eventually fall. And when they fall, the walls are a little wider. The river at the bottom is still carrying sediment, still working its way deeper and wider, with every cubic foot of water that passes. The Grand Canyon in 10 million years will be different from the Grand Canyon today. Wider in some places, different in its particular architecture. Some buttes and temples that stand today will have eroded entirely away. New forms will have emerged. The canyon is not a finished thing. It is a process, a conversation between water and rock and time. One that has been going on for millions of years, and will continue for millions more, long after any human presence has faded. The canyon is expanding slowly even now. The carving of the Grand Canyon did not stop when geologists began studying it. It has not paused for visitors or for photographs. It continues, quietly and without ceremony, in the way that geological processes always continue. Every rainstorm that falls on the canyon rim sends water running down into the canyon, carrying particles of rock with it. Every winter freeze and spring thaw works at the cracks in the canyon walls, prying rock apart in a process called frost weathering. Boulders that have clung to the canyon walls for thousands of years eventually fall. And when they fall, the walls are a little wider. The river at the bottom is still carrying sediment, still working its way deeper and wider, with every cubic foot of water that passes. The Grand Canyon in 10 million years will be different from the Grand Canyon today. Wider in some places, different in its particular architecture. Some buttes and temples that stand today will have eroded entirely away. New forms will have emerged. The canyon is not a finished thing. It is a process, a conversation between water and rock and time. One that has been going on for millions of years, and will continue for millions more, long after any human presence has faded. The Grand Canyon at sunrise holds a particular light. There are people who set alarms in the darkness and drive to the rim before first light, simply for the experience of watching the canyon wake is less than #. 25 is greater than in the last minutes before sunrise. The canyon is barely visible. A great dark presence in the pre-dawn grey. The walls are shapes rather than colors. The depth is felt more than seen. Then the first light touches the highest buttes. It comes from the east, warm and nearly horizontal, catching the topmost surfaces of the canyon's temples and towers, while the gorge below remains in shadow. The Vishnu Temple, Wotan's throne, Zoroaster Temple. These are the names the early explorers and cartographers gave to the great buttes and mesas of the canyon interior, names borrowed from the religious traditions of the world, because the landscape seemed to demand that kind of gravity. In those first minutes of light, the buttes glow like coals, vivid and particular against the shadow below. The light descends gradually as the sun rises, moving down the walls in slow progression, as though the canyon is being slowly revealed rather than simply illuminated. By the time full morning light fills the canyon, the whole drama has played out, over perhaps 15 or 20 minutes. Those who watched it tend to stand in silence for a while afterward, not quite ready to speak, not quite willing to return to ordinary time. The canyon has different names in different languages. The Hopi word for the Grand Canyon translates roughly as the place of emergence. It is the site, in their cosmology, where humanity entered this world from the world below. The Navajo Nation, whose territory borders the canyon on the east, knows the Colorado River as the Big Red River. Their connection to the canyon landscape extends back generations and is woven through their ceremonies and their understanding of their own history. The Havasu call the canyon Cataract Canyon, in part after the cataracts and falls of their home waters. But in their broader sense of the place, the whole canyon system is simply home. The context of their existence, the ground of their identity. The Spanish explorers who encountered the canyon in the 1500s called it the Rio Grande, the Grand River. Later, Anglo-American explorers named the canyon as we know it now, Grand Canyon, a name that is simple and entirely accurate, and still somehow inadequate. Grand, from the Latin, large, impressive, great. A word that means something enormous and worthy of respect. It is not wrong. The canyon is grand in the oldest and fullest sense of that word. Grand in scale, grand in age, grand in the way it holds the entire story of a planet, in its layered and colorful walls. The river otter returned to the Colorado River after a long absence. In the decades following the construction of the dams, is less than #0. 75 is greater than the North American river otter disappeared from the Colorado River within the Grand Canyon. The colder water temperatures and the changed ecosystem no longer suited them. They were gone from a river they had swum for thousands of years. Then, quietly and without announcement, they began to return. River otter sightings in the Grand Canyon have been reported in recent years. Small groups, a few individuals at first, moving through stretches of the canyon where they had not been seen in living memory. The otters have found ways to adapt to the changed river. They use the side canyon streams, which retain warmer temperatures. They concentrate in areas where the cold river water is offset by warm inflows from springs. Their return is one of the smaller and quieter stories of the canyon, unlikely to make headlines alongside the condor recovery. But to the river guides who see them occasionally, sliding silently through a calm stretch of water at dusk, their presence means something. A river recovering some of what was lost. A creature returning to a home it never forgot. The canyon making space again for something that belongs in it. The canyon stores the memory of ancient monsoons. The American Southwest is shaped in significant part by the summer monsoon, a seasonal shift in wind patterns that draws warm, moisture-laden air from the Gulf of Mexico is less than #0. 75 is greater than up into the high desert, When it works as it should, afternoon thunderstorms build over the plateau and deliver rain in brief, violent downpours from July through September. The canyon records the history of these monsoons, in its erosion patterns and in its sediment record. Wetter periods left more sediment in certain formations. Drier periods left less. Floods carved channels that are still readable in the canyon's tributary drainages. There are also the flash floods. In the summer monsoon season, a storm that falls miles away on the plateau can send a wall of water down a dry canyon within minutes. The side canyons of the Grand Canyon are particularly vulnerable to this. A hiker in a narrow slot canyon can be in sunshine and dry rock, while a storm 10 miles away is filling the drainage above them. The water that arrives carries enormous energy. It scours the canyon floor. It moves boulders. It deposits new sediment in layers that tell future geologists about rainfall patterns in a particular summer, thousands of years from now. The canyon breathes with the monsoon. Dry and still for most of the year, then briefly, violently alive with water, then dry again, patient again, returning to its usual quiet as the season turns and the storms move south. The Grand Canyon glows differently in cloudy light. The canyon is most often photographed in clear conditions. Blue sky, hard shadows, the saturated colors of direct sunlight on red stone. But some of the people who know the canyon best prefer it under clouds. When an overcast sky filters the sunlight, the canyon's colors deepen and become more complex. Without the bleaching effect of direct sun, the subtle variations in the rock become more visible. The purples in the shadow zones, the pale greens in certain limestone bands, the warm bronze of the Supai group. The canyon under clouds is softer, more contemplative. The light is even rather than directional, revealing texture rather than drama. Before a monsoon storm arrives over the canyon, the light can turn particularly strange. The sky darkens to the west while the canyon walls still catch diffuse light. The colors intensify, the shadows deepen, and then the first distant thunder rolls through the canyon. That long, reverberating boom that seems to come from everywhere at once, and the smell of rain on hot stone reaches you. A few moments before the first drops fall. Petrichor, the word for that smell, the ancient and instantly recognizable scent of rain meeting dry earth. In the Grand Canyon, it is particularly vivid. The stone has been dry for so long, the air so arid, that when rain finally arrives is less than #0. 7.5 hash is greater than the release of that smell is almost overwhelming. The inner canyon has a geological feature called Matkamiba Canyon. Among the many side canyons that branch off the main Colorado corridor, one is notable for its architecture. Matkamiba Canyon, known to river guides simply as Matkat, is a narrow slot in the Mule limestone that opens suddenly into a wide circular amphitheater. The walls curve overhead in smooth, water-polished arcs. The rock is a pale grey-green. The floor is smooth stone, polished by centuries of flowing water. And above the open ceiling of the amphitheater, a circle of sky. River parties stop here to sit, to let the stillness of the place settle. Some bring music instruments and play in the natural acoustics. Some simply find a ledge of smooth stone and sit with their eyes open or closed, while the canyon holds them in its curved walls. The sound in Matkatameba is unique even by canyon standards. The curved walls focus and reflect sound in ways that make voices and music seem to come from the walls themselves, as though the rock is participating in whatever sound is made. It is the kind of place that makes people quiet, even before they consciously decide to be. A place that asks for attention, simply by existing. The canyon holds stories we cannot yet read. For all that geologists and biologists and archaeologists have learned about the Grand Canyon is less than #0.75 is greater than over more than a century of intensive study, there is far more that remains unknown. The deep cave systems have been only partially explored. New species of invertebrates are still being discovered in the canyon's more remote springs. The archaeological record of the canyon's deepest human past has barely been touched. The genetics of the canyon's isolated populations, species that have been separated from their relatives by the canyon's walls for thousands of generations, contain evolutionary histories that have not yet been written. The canyon's acoustic environment has barely been studied. The psychological effects of long-term canyon immersion are only beginning to be understood. The cultural histories of the 11 affiliated tribes contain knowledge of the canyon that has never been fully shared with outside researchers, and perhaps never will be. There are things the canyon knows that we do not yet know how to ask about. Stories in the rock that require instruments not yet invented to read. Biological relationships that require frameworks not yet developed to understand. The canyon keeps its deeper secrets with the same patience with which it keeps everything. Unhurried, unconcerned with our timelines, waiting for us to develop the capacity to understand what it has been trying to show us all along. The night at the Grand Canyon carries a particular kind of stillness. In the final hours of the day at the Grand Canyon, something happens that is worth describing slowly. The sun drops below the western horizon. The last orange light drains from the highest buttes. The reds cool to purples and then to grays. And then, gradually, the sky opens. There is no transition from twilight to darkness at the canyon quite like anywhere else. Because the canyon itself holds the last of the day's warmth long after the sky has gone dark, the air above it has a particular quality. Still and dry and faintly warm. The kind of air that invites you to stop moving and simply breathe. The stars come out, not all at once, but in a slow gathering. First the brightest, then the medium ones, then the fainter ones, until the sky is layered with them from horizon to horizon. And below that sky, invisible now, but present, the canyon waits in the dark. The rock still holding the day's heat, the river still moving somewhere unseen, the walls still standing as they have stood, for millions upon millions of years, patient and enormous and quietly extraordinary. Somewhere in the canyon below, a canyon wren sings a last cascading note before settling in for the night. A raven tucks itself into a ledge. The cottonwoods along Bright Angel Creek rustle in a breath of cool air moving up through the gorge. And then stillness. Deep, unhurried, ancient stillness. The kind of stillness that has no beginning and no end. The night at the Grand Canyon carries a particular kind of stillness. In the final hours of the day at the Grand Canyon, something happens that is worth describing slowly. The sun drops below the western horizon. The last orange light drains from the highest buttes. The reds cool to purples and then to grays. And then, gradually, the sky opens. There is no transition from twilight to darkness at the canyon quite like anywhere else. Because the canyon itself holds the last of the day's warmth long after the sky has gone dark, the air above it has a particular quality. Still and dry and faintly warm. The kind of air that invites you to stop moving and simply breathe. The stars come out, not all at once, but in a slow gathering. First the brightest, then the medium ones, then the fainter ones, until the sky is layered with them from horizon to horizon. And below that sky, invisible now but present, the canyon waits in the dark. The rock still holding the day's heat, the river still moving somewhere unseen, the walls still standing as they have stood, for millions upon millions of years, patient and enormous and quietly extraordinary. Somewhere in the canyon below is less than #0. 7.5 hash is greater than a canyon. Wren sings a last cascading note before settling in for the night. A raven tucks itself into a ledge. The cottonwoods along Bright Angel Creek rustle in a breath of cool air moving up through the gorge. And then stillness. Deep, unhurried, ancient stillness. The kind of stillness that has no beginning and no end. The canyon and the human heart have always understood each other. There is something about vastness that the human nervous system craves, even as it is overwhelmed by it. We evolved on a landscape far more open and wild than most of us now inhabit. Our brains were shaped by tens of thousands of years of moving through enormous spaces, reading weather and landscape and distance, sleeping under open sky. The modern world has replaced most of that vastness with walls, with ceilings, with the tight geometry of rooms and buildings and streets. We are a creature built for open space, living mostly in enclosed ones. The Grand Canyon undoes something that the built world has done to us. It gives back the open horizon, the vast unstructured space, the sky with nothing between you and it. Research has suggested that humans process natural environments differently from built ones. The fractal geometry of natural landscapes, the self-similar patterns of rock and cliff and canyon, is processed with less cognitive effort than the sharp angles of built environments. Natural settings lower cortisol levels. They reduce heart rate. They invite a mode of attention that is diffuse and open, rather than focused and effortful. The Grand Canyon, more than almost any other natural landscape, triggers this state. The brain simply cannot maintain its usual tightly wound focus in the presence of something that large and that old. It gives up trying to control its environment and settles, instead, into the simpler and older task of simply being present with it. The canyon's stones were once mountains. The Vishnu schist and the Zoroaster granite at the bottom of the canyon are the eroded roots of mountains. Nearly 2 billion years ago, this region was the site of a major mountain-building event. Tectonic plates collided and crumpled, forcing rock upward into peaks that may have rivaled the modern Himalayas in height. These mountains stood for millions of years. Then, erosion, the same patient force that later carved the canyon, went to work on them. Rain and ice and wind wore them down. Rivers carried their material away to distant seas. Over hundreds of millions of years, the mountains were reduced entirely to their roots. What remains at the bottom of the Grand Canyon is the deepest part of those mountains. The material that was buried most deeply under the peaks is less than .075 is greater than transformed by heat and pressure into schist and granite. The mountains themselves are entirely gone. Their peaks eroded to nothing. Their flanks dispersed across an ancient sea floor. Only their roots remain, exposed now at the bottom of a river canyon, on the surface of a desert. Rocks that were once buried miles underground. Mountains that once scraped the clouds, now visible at the bottom of a gorge, polished by a river, touched occasionally by human hands. The earth keeps nothing forever in the same form. Everything is always becoming something else. Mountains become plains. Seas become deserts. Deep rock becomes surface rock. And eventually, perhaps, surface rock becomes deep rock again, drawn back down into the earth, to begin the whole long cycle once more. The canyon teaches patience in a world that has forgotten it. We live in a time that moves very fast. Information arrives constantly. Decisions are expected immediately. Attention is pulled in every direction at once. The pace of things has accelerated beyond what our nervous systems were designed to sustain, and most of us feel that in ways that are hard to articulate, but impossible to ignore. The Grand Canyon has been here for 6 million years. It deepened at a rate measured in fractions of an inch per century. The layers in its walls were deposited is less than .075 is greater than over timescales measured in millions of years. The oldest rocks at its floor took shape nearly 2 billion years ago. To spend time at the canyon is to be reminded of a different relationship with time. Not the urgent, compressed, deadline-driven time of modern life, but the slow, geological, unhurried time in which rivers carve canyons, and mountains rise and fall, and life adapts and evolves and continues. There is a kind of permission in that. Permission to be slow. Permission to be patient. Permission to trust that the important things, the things that truly matter, will get where they are going, in their own time. The canyon was not carved by hurry. Nothing real was ever built by rushing. The water simply flowed, day after day, year after year, century after century, and the canyon appeared. The Grand Canyon teaches something wordless about time. Every person who stands at the rim of the Grand Canyon long enough arrives at some version of the same thought. That the world is old in a way that cannot be held in the mind all at once. We can say the words 2 billion years, 500 million years, 1,200,000,000 years of missing time. We can say those words and feel something move in us. A kind of quiet vertigo is less than #0. 75 hash is greater than a loosening of the grip we hold on our daily concerns. Standing at the canyon rim, or, better yet, sitting at it quietly in the late afternoon, watching the light change on the far walls, there is a softening that happens. The ordinary preoccupations of a human day begin to feel less pressing, less permanent. Because the canyon puts things in proportion, not cruelly, not by making you feel insignificant, but gently, by showing you that the world has been working on something extraordinary for a very long time, and that your presence in it, brief as it is also part of that extraordinary thing. You are made of the same elements as the canyon walls. The calcium in your bones is the same calcium in the Redwall limestone. The iron in your blood gives the canyon its red color. The water in your body is the same water that carved the inner gorge. You are not separate from what you are looking at. You are continuous with it, made of the same earth, shaped by the same processes, part of the same long, slow, beautiful story. And so, dear listener, we come gently to the end of our time in the canyon. We have descended through nearly 2 billion years of Earth's own history. We have touched the oldest exposed rock on the planet's surface. We have stood at the edge of a sea that no longer exists, is less than #0. 75 hash is greater than and beneath a sky that belonged to creatures long since gone. We have walked beside the Colorado River in its winding passage through the stone. We have rested beneath cottonwoods at Phantom Ranch, listened to the wind move through side canyons, watched condors circle on thermals of warm canyon air. We have sat quietly with the great unconformity, that billion-year silence in the rock, and felt something wordless about loss and time. We have seen the canyon fill with fog and drain of light at sunset, and open into a sky of extraordinary stars. The Grand Canyon does not need us to appreciate it. It was here long before appreciation existed. It will be here long after. But there is something in the human heart that responds to vast and ancient things. Something that quiets. Something that settles. Something that remembers, without needing to be told, that the world is larger than our worries. So tonight, as you lie here in the dark, let the canyon hold you the way it holds everything that enters it. Gently, without judgment, with the patient, unhurried hospitality of something that has been here for a very, very long time. Let your body be heavy. Let your thoughts grow slow and soft, the way the canyon light softens at the end of day. Let the river carry whatever is left of the day's noise is less than #0. 75 hash is greater than downstream and away. You are lying on a planet that has been building something beautiful for 4.5 billion years. The canyon is one version of that beauty. You are another. Picture the canyon now in darkness. The walls invisible but present. The river a faint murmur far below. The stars overhead exactly as they have always been. The air still and dry and faintly warm. There is nothing to solve here. Nothing to do. Nowhere to be. Only the rock and the river and the dark. Only the slow, patient turning of the earth. Only this breath, and the next one, and the quiet that comes after. Close your eyes. Breathe slowly, and let the canyon carry you into the deep and restful dark. If your eyes are still open, the next video will be waiting when you are ready. But if sleep is already arriving, let it come. The canyon will be here when you wake. It always is. Good night.